I knew something was wrong the moment Richard Coleman stopped talking. Meetings with Richard were never quiet. He liked the sound of his own voice, liked filling space with confident phrases and half-jokes that signaled authority without ever stating it outright. Silence from him was calculated. A pause meant he was watching you, measuring what you might give away without realizing it. That afternoon, the pause came after he stood, closed the door to his office, and leaned back against his desk instead of returning to his chair. "You've been doing excellent work, Emma," he said. His voice softened, smoothed into something that pretended to be casual. Frankly, indispensable. I inclined my head just enough to acknowledge the compliment. Gratitude was currency here. Too much looked desperate. Too little looked arrogant. "Thank you," I said. "I try to be thorough." His lips curved just slightly. "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you." The city glowed behind him through the floor-to-ceiling window. 40 stories below, traffic crawled like veins pumping light. I had learned, over the past 2 years, where to fix my eyes during conversations like this, somewhere neutral, impersonal. His shoulder, the edge of the desk, never his face for too long. "We're approaching the end of your current visa period," Richard continued, folding his arms. "HR flagged it this morning." My pulse ticked once, sharp and controlled. Of course they had. "Yes," I said. "I've already prepared the documentation for an extension. Performance reviews, project summaries. That's the formal route." He interrupted gently. "And it usually works. Eventually." Eventually. The words settled between us, heavy. "In the meantime," he went on, pushing away from the desk and finally sitting, "there are informal conversations that help things move faster, at senior levels." I waited. Silence, I had learned, made people explain themselves. Richard smiled as if we shared a private joke. "We could talk about it over dinner, more relaxed. My place is quiet. Distractions are minimal." There it was. I felt the shift internally, like numbers realigning in a spreadsheet when one cell changes. Columns recalculated. Outcomes updated. I had imagined this possibility before, had prepared for it abstractly, but anticipation never carried the same weight as reality. Dinner. His place. I did not flinch. I did not inhale sharply or look away. I did not allow the anger, the disgust, the cold clarity to show. Instead, I let my face perform, a skill I'd honed long before I ever arrived in this country. "That's very kind of you," I said carefully. "I'd have to check my schedule." Richard studied me. His gaze lingered half a second too long, like a thumb pressing against glass to test for cracks. "Of course," he said. "Just let me know." The meeting ended normally after that. Project milestones, deadlines, a casual joke about auditors being vampires who hated sunlight. I laughed at the appropriate moment, gathered my notebook, and stood. As I reached the door, he added, "You're doing great things here, Emma. I'd hate to see a technicality ruin that." I smiled again. So would I. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. At my desk, the office hummed with late afternoon efficiency. Phones rang, keyboards clicked. Someone argued quietly with a spreadsheet formula 2 rows over. To anyone watching, I was simply another analyst returning to work. Calm, focused, invisible. Inside, everything sharpened. I opened my email and replied to a vendor inquiry I'd been ignoring. Then I updated a forecast model by adjusting a single assumption, watching the outputs refresh. Routine actions, steady breathing, control. Only when the floor began to empty and the sound level dropped did I open my personal notebook, the one I never synced, never stored in the cloud. Thursday, 4:17 p.m. Richard Coleman, dinner invitation. Visa mentioned before invitation. I stared at the words, then added one more line. Pattern suspected. Verification required. I didn't yet know how deep it went. I didn't know who else had sat in that chair before me, nodding politely while a threat disguised itself as an opportunity. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Richard Coleman believed he had leverage. That belief was his mistake. As the sun dipped nigh the skyline and the lights outside grew brighter, I shut down my workstation and slipped my coat on. I stayed later than usual, not to work, but to think. By the time I left the building, my decision had already been made. I would accept nothing. I would document everything. And if Richard wanted dinner, I would give him an audit instead, one he would never see coming. The invitations were just the beginning. I did not go home after work. Instead, I stayed until the cleaning crew began their slow migration across the floor, their carts squeaking softly like warnings. The office looked different after hours, less performative, more honest. Desks left half-organized, coffee rings drying into permanent marks, monitors still glowing with unfinished thoughts. This was when the building stopped pretending it belonged to anyone important and reverted to what it really was, a machine that consumed time. I liked it then. I logged back into the system under my own credentials. No disguises, no tricks. Everything I planned to do would begin squarely inside the rules. Richard believed power lived in shadows and silence. People like him always underestimated policy, the dull, boring language that no one read closely because it wasn't exciting enough to seem dangerous. Compliance manuals were my comfort reading. I navigated past budgets and forecasts and into the document repository, pulling up the internal compliance handbook. It was over 600 pages long, revised annually, referenced constantly, understood rarely. I had skimmed it once during onboarding like everyone else. Tonight, I read it properly, section by section, clause by clause. The language was dry, intentionally so. Sentences stretched on with qualifiers and subclauses, definitions referring back to definitions in a self-consuming loop. It was designed to discourage curiosity. I leaned into it instead, highlighting phrases, cross-checking references, building a mental map. Around page 300, something shifted. Preliminary Risk Intervention Authority. The heading alone made my pulse steady. I scrolled slowly. Any senior financial analyst identifying potential exposure to financial, legal, or reputational risk may initiate a preliminary internal audit using raw source data. Such review may be conducted independently and confidentially for assessment purposes. No approval required, no notification to department heads, no timeline specified. I read it 3 times, then once more aloud, quietly, to make sure I wasn't imagining clauses that weren't there. The section had likely been added years ago, after some scandal no one wanted to repeat. Over time, it had become a legal appendix, technically alive, functionally forgotten. I checked the revision history. 8 years old, never invoked. A slow smile spread across my face, genuine this time. I was a senior financial analyst. I had been for 18 months. My performance reviews were spotless. No warnings, no disputes. My access level was exactly what it needed to be. I didn't click anything yet. First, I assessed the risk, not the corporate one, but mine. If Richard suspected even a whisper of defiance, he could retaliate in 100 subtle ways. Reassignments, performance ambiguity, Concerns raised at exactly the wrong moment, and then there was immigration. The softest blade, because it never needed to be swung. So everything had to be precise, boring, defensible. I opened a new folder within the audit workspace, not labeling it with names or accusations. I called it PRIA 2025-01, a format consistent with abandoned drafts and test projects scattered all over the system. Camouflage through compliance. Next, I drafted a single-page scope document. Objective: assess potential financial exposure related to external consulting engagements exceeding aggregate threshold risk. Nothing emotional, nothing personal. I saved it, then paused, hands resting on the keyboard. This was the moment where most people hesitated, where doubt crept in and suggested maybe they had misread the room, misjudged intentions, that maybe dinner was just dinner, that favors were just favors, that survival meant compromise. I thought of Richard's pause, his smile, the word eventually. I hit save. Once the scope existed, the system opened itself to me like a door that had never been locked. Raw transaction data, vendor registries, internal billing logs, tools I rarely needed for my normal workload, but was fully authorized to access. I downloaded nothing. That would create flags. Instead, I built views, reconstructed reports piece by piece. No summaries, no executive dashboards. I wanted the bones. The first pass showed nothing unusual. Clean numbers, beautifully balanced. Richard's division was a model of efficiency, the kind leadership loved to highlight in quarterly meetings. That in itself was suspicious. Nothing real was that clean. Around 10:30, I stood and stretched, rolling stiffness out of my shoulders. The cleaning crew eyed me with mild curiosity, then moved on. I returned with a cup of terrible vending machine coffee and adjusted my approach. Instead of looking for anomalies, I looked for patterns that were too consistent. Consulting fees that always fell just below review thresholds. Vendors with generic names, Global Solutions, Strategic Initiatives Group, appearing across unrelated projects. Round numbers where variance should have lived. I built a comparison table, then another. The numbers began to whisper. I didn't rush. I let the data reveal itself in its own time, noting small discrepancies without yet drawing conclusions. This wasn't about catching someone red-handed. It was about proving a system existed at all. By midnight, my eyes burned, but my mind was clear. I logged everything I had done in a private timeline, noting access points and timestamps, already thinking like someone who expected to be questioned later. Before shutting down, I reopened my notebook. Compliance clause confirmed. Preliminary audit authorized. No notification required. Initial irregularities detected. Requires deeper reconstruction. Richard Coleman directly oversees majority of flagged project approvals. Correlation not yet causation. I closed the notebook and slipped it back into my bag. As I walked out of the building, the city was quieter, stripped of its daytime confidence. The streetlights reflected off glass and steel, indifferent witnesses. Richard believed rules bent for men like him. He had no idea how often they simply waited. Tomorrow, I would look closer. By the third morning, the reports felt like they were mocking me. I sat perfectly still in my chair, eyes fixed on a spreadsheet that should have made me relax. Every column balanced, every variance reconciled, every summary aligned exactly with what upper management expected to see. If I had been doing my normal job, quarterly forecasting, margin optimization, cost analysis, I would have approved it without hesitation and moved on. That was the danger of clean numbers. They invited trust. I minimized the executive summary view and reopened the raw data feeds. Transaction timestamps, invoice histories, vendor registration metadata. The unfiltered, ugly side of accounting that most people preferred never to look at directly. Clean numbers came from somewhere. My job now was to find out where. I rebuilt the reports from scratch. No templates, no macros pulled from finance-approved models. I copied the raw entries into a blank sheet and started reconstructing the financial story manually, line by line, as if I were auditing a company that didn't know it was being audited. It took hours. The first anomaly appeared just after noon, subtle enough that I missed it twice. A consulting payment, $248,900, categorized under operational strategy support. Perfectly ordinary on its own. Then I noticed another entry 2 weeks later, $249,300, different department, same category, same vendor. Both amounts sat just below the internal review threshold. I checked the next quarter. 3 more. Same vendor. Slightly altered invoice descriptions. Same pattern. Never crossing the line that would trigger automatic escalation. Whoever designed this system understood controls. Not just how they worked, but how people interacted with them. I felt a familiar chill. This wasn't sloppiness or opportunism. It was architecture. I tagged the entries and expanded outward, pulling every transaction tied to that vendor over the past 3 years. The totals climbed fast, individually harmless, collectively obscene, and still nothing overtly illegal. That was the brilliance of it. Everything complied. Everywhere. On paper. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The question wasn't if money was being misused. The question was, to what end? When I opened my eyes again, I changed tactics. Instead of following vendors, I followed approvals. Richard Coleman's name didn't appear directly in most of the records. That would have been amateurish. Instead, his fingerprints showed up in patterns of delegation. Approvals routed consistently through the same 2 senior managers. Escalations diverted. Reviews shortened due to time sensitivity. Always justified. Always reasonable. I mapped approval chains visually. A spiderweb emerged, neat and efficient, converging on Richard's office without ever quite reaching it. By mid-afternoon, my inbox chimed. Richard Coleman. Following up on our conversation. Let me know about Friday. I stared at the message longer than necessary, then marked it unread. Pressure arrived early when people sensed control slipping. I returned to the numbers. Another oddity surfaced. Duplicate vendors. Same addresses. Same phone numbers. Slightly different names. I cross-referenced them against the internal registry. All properly onboarded. All background checks passed. Of course they had. If you submitted paperwork through enough departments, eventual approval was inevitable. Still, something bothered me. I exported the vendor list, not externally, just into a sandbox view, and sorted by address. Entire rows snapped into place. 5 consulting firms operating out of the same floor of the same building in Delaware. Another cluster in Cyprus. Another in Singapore. Shells. Not proof yet, but structure. I pulled corporate ownership data from publicly available sources and began matching it manually. Many trails went nowhere by design. A few didn't. Circular ownership. Subsidiaries owning each other in elegant loops that led nowhere and everywhere at once. My hands moved with mechanical calm while my thoughts raced ahead. The money came in, moved sideways, exited clean. No theft in the classic sense. No personal enrichment that could be traced easily. So why build something this careful? The answer arrived unexpectedly. Hidden not in large payments, but in petty adjustments, rounding patterns across reports. Someone had tuned the system not just to move money, but to conceal attention. Perfection engineered to lull oversight. Every report was designed not to withstand scrutiny, but to discourage it. Someone didn't want anyone looking too closely. At 5 sharp, the office emptied. I stayed. As evening crept in, I replayed Richard's words in my head. Technicality. Eventually. He hadn't threatened me directly. That was important. Men like him believed deniability was the same as innocence. I opened my notebook again. Reconstructed reports revealed deliberate threshold avoidance. Repeated vendors, shared addresses, shell indicators present. Approval chains consistently deflect oversight away from RC without attribution. System appears designed for concealment rather than profit alone. Motivation unclear. Suspect non-financial leverage. I closed it slowly. This was no longer just about money. Clean numbers were the surface layer, the camouflage. Beneath them lay something more personal, more predatory. Richard's dinner invitation pulsed at the edge of my thoughts, not as temptation, but as context. Leverage required vulnerability, and vulnerability needed repetition. I shut down my workstation and stood, feeling the familiar ache between my shoulders. As I walked out into the night, one truth settled firmly in my mind. The numbers weren't lying. They were protecting someone, and soon they wouldn't be able to anymore. I stopped trusting the numbers alone on a Tuesday night. They had taken me as far as they could, far enough to outline the shape of something wrong without revealing what lived inside it. To go deeper, I needed context, people, structures, intent. Money was just the language. I needed the grammar. So I followed the consultants. It started with a simple list. Every external consulting firm that had billed Richard's division over the last 5 years. 83 names appeared at first. That number dropped quickly once I removed legitimate long-term partners and firms whose work could be independently verified. What remained were 22 entities. Too many to be coincidence. Too alike to be independent. I built a separate map, this time not inside our internal systems, but in my own head and notebook. Addresses, incorporation dates, directors, banking jurisdictions. I didn't automate it. Automation left trails. This required patience. The first pattern was geographical: Delaware, Cyprus, Singapore, Estonia. Jurisdictions chosen not for tax advantages alone, but for opacity mixed with respectability. Places that raised eyebrows only if you already suspected something. The second pattern was temporal. Most of the firms had been created within a narrow 18-month window 4 years ago. That time frame aligned precisely with Richard's promotion into his current role. Before that, his division used standard, well-known consultancies. Afterward, it blossomed into boutique strategy partners no one outside the firm seemed to have heard of. I pulled public filings one by one. Many listed nominee directors, professional placeholders whose names appeared on hundreds of unrelated companies. Others showed layered ownership structures that folded back on themselves like mirrored hallways. Each layer was legal. Each layer was expensive to maintain. Someone was investing serious effort to stay invisible. Around 9, my phone vibrated softly against the desk. Richard Coleman. Still on for Friday? I can make it special. I flipped the phone face down without replying. His timing wasn't accidental. He sensed momentum, even if he didn't yet understand its direction. Back to the consultants. I chose one firm at random, Global Strategic Horizons, and dove deep. Their website was immaculate and meaningless. Vague language, smiling stock photos, case studies without clients. A phone number answered by a pleasant voicemail that never returned calls. Their address led to a shared office space. Virtual receptionist. No signage. But their bank routing numbers pulled me somewhere else. Using transaction metadata buried deep in payable records, I traced intermediary banks to a Luxembourg clearing institution. From there, funds splintered. Some transferred onward, some cycled back weeks later labeled as reimbursements. Circular payments. Classic laundering behavior, except the sums weren't being siphoned off into luxury purchases or real estate. They were being repositioned, cleaned, disguised. I overlaid the consulting payments against internal payroll adjustments. That was when my stomach tightened. Special bonuses, retention incentives, project continuity allowances, all perfectly legitimate, all approved by separate committees, and always timed months after consulting invoices cleared. Not to executives, to employees. I narrowed the list. Women, highly rated performers, foreign nationals, temporary visas, analysts, managers, project leads. All of them had worked under Richard's oversight at some point. All had received sudden, generous compensation adjustments, followed by transfers, quiet departures, or non-renewals. This wasn't theft. It was hush money. My hands went cold as the realization settled. The consultants weren't providing services. They were vehicles, buffers to move money without linking it directly to its purpose, to buy silence, compliance, exit. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling lights humming softly above me. How many dinners? How many conversations framed as opportunities? How many careers quietly erased when cooperation ended? I documented everything meticulously. Timelines instead of accusations, structures instead of conclusions. Anyone could argue away a single transaction. Patterns were harder to dismiss. Just before midnight, I noticed something that made me stop typing altogether. One consulting firm, Helix Advisory Group, had received fewer payments than the others. Smaller amounts, less frequent. Almost an afterthought. But Helix's ownership trail didn't vanish into professional nominees. It ended abruptly, with a familiar name. Richard Coleman's wife, listed not directly, of course, a trust beneficiary, 2 steps removed, technically uninvolved, legally insulated, but there it was, proof of personal entanglement. My breath came slowly and deliberately as I absorbed it. This was the line where misconduct crossed into personal profit and coercion intertwined, enough to interest people far beyond internal compliance. I closed every window and logged out carefully. Before leaving, I wrote one final note in my notebook. Consulting firms are transactional cover. Purpose, silence, leverage, controlled exits. Strong correlation between payments and visa-dependent women. Direct personal link discovered. High-risk leverage point identified. As I walked out into the cool night air, my phone buzzed again. Richard Coleman. I'll assume yes unless I hear otherwise. He thought inevitability was on his side. He was wrong. Friday was coming, and so was the truth. I stopped looking at spreadsheets the morning I realized the numbers were no longer the most important evidence. Numbers could tell you what was happening. People told you why. It began with a name, Marina Kovac, senior systems analyst, Hungarian, highly rated, transferred out of Richard's division 2 years earlier after requesting new challenges. That was the language HR used when nothing had gone wrong on paper, but something had gone very wrong everywhere else. I pulled her file. Flawless performance reviews, consistent promotions, a retention bonus issued 8 months before her transfer. exactly 4 weeks after Helix Advisory Group invoiced for organizational alignment consulting. I opened another file. Yara Adebayo, Nigerian, project manager, visa dependent. Contract not renewed due to changing strategic priorities. Same bonus pattern, same timing, different consultant, then another, then another. By noon, I had 12 names on a list I kept offline, handwritten, the old-fashioned way. I didn't want search logs. I didn't want digital trails. Paper didn't talk unless forced. 12 women. Every one of them a top performer. Every one of them had worked directly under Richard. Every one of them had been foreign-born. Temporary status. Professional ambition paired with existential vulnerability, and every one of them had left quietly. No complaints, no lawsuits, no formal grievances. That absence screamed louder than any accusation. I started charting timelines, hiring date, promotion, first close interaction with Richard, usually noted indirectly through project lead assignments or calendar overlaps. Then the bonuses. The dinners, though unrecorded, appeared as sudden after-hours calendar blocks labeled vaguely client engagement, strategic discussion, external stakeholder meeting, deniable, always deniable. Then came the exit. Transfers framed as opportunities, departures framed as personal choices. Visas allowed to expire just slowly enough that no one could blame any individual decision. Richard hadn't invented this system. He'd perfected it. Around 3 o'clock, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the warning sign that I was getting too close emotionally. Rage made mistakes. Fear made mistakes. I stood, walked to the restroom, and stared at myself in the mirror until my pulse steadied. I looked normal. That was my advantage. Back at my desk, I asked a different question. Why no complaints? The answer was painfully obvious once I allowed myself to think it, because complaints require belief, in fairness, in rescue, in survival afterward. Temporary visas destroyed that belief systematically. The risk wasn't just professional, it was existential. I was not special. I was simply next. My inbox chimed again. Richard Coleman. Hope your week's been productive. Friday still works on my end. I didn't respond. Silence, used correctly, was a weapon. I turned to HR records next. Not files, but metadata. Who accessed what? When updates were made? Who closed cases? One name appeared repeatedly at crucial moments. An HR manager who specialized in complex employment transitions. Always adjacent. Never central. Protected by procedure. I didn't dig into her yet. Not until I needed to. At home that night, I spread my notes across the kitchen table. Papers, timelines, arrows connecting seemingly innocuous events into something unmistakable. This wasn't a series of isolated abuses. It was a machine. Each woman represented a unit of risk that had been identified, leveraged, neutralized. Bonuses paid not as rewards, but as compensation for silence. Consulting firms laundering both money and intent. HR smoothing edges until nothing remained sharp enough to cut anyone powerful. And Richard at the center of it, not sweating, not grabbing, not threatening overtly, just offering dinner. I sat down heavily and let myself feel the anger at last. Not hot, explosive anger, but cold, clarifying rage, the kind that reorganized priorities with brutal efficiency. This was bigger than me, that both terrified and steadied me. I opened my notebook and wrote carefully, pattern confirmed, target selected by visa dependency and performance visibility, leverage applied through career advancement, implicit immigration threat, silence purchased, exits managed, records sanitized. Systemic abuse, not individual misconduct. I underlined the last line twice. Richard believed women like me came alone into rooms like that. He had built his system on that assumption. He was wrong. I didn't know yet who would stand with me or how many channels it would take to collapse something this carefully engineered. But I knew the next step wasn't more investigation. It was connection. Tomorrow, I would start reaching out. Not recklessly, not emotionally. I would find allies who had already escaped the machine and survived it. People who had nothing left to lose but silence. As I closed the notebook, my phone vibrated one last time for the night. Richard Coleman. I'll pick you up at 7. I smiled, alone in my kitchen. He thought the pattern made him untouchable. He didn't realize I had already learned how it worked. And once you understood a system, breaking it was only a matter of time. Reaching out was the most dangerous part. Not because people would refuse to talk. Silence had already proven contagious, but because reaching out created new variables. Every message sent could be misread. Every question could trigger fear. Every wrong word might travel back to someone I didn't want alerted yet. So I didn't start with questions. I started with time. Late on Wednesday evening, I searched for Nina Patel on LinkedIn. Former senior accountant. Left the company 18 months earlier, now working for a mid-sized manufacturing firm 3 states away. Her departure had been quiet, framed internally as a pursuit of better work-life balance. I didn't message her through the platform, too traceable. Instead, I found her published email on a professional conference panel page and waited until nearly 10 to send a single, careful sentence. I hope this isn't unwelcome. I'm reviewing some legacy processes from our time at Colemanson. I'd value your perspective on a few timelines. Nothing formal. No mention of names, no insinuations. Just tone. She replied 40 minutes later. I can talk. Phone is better. Tomorrow before work. When I read the message, my hands trembled. Not with fear, but with confirmation. People knew. They always knew. They just didn't know who to trust. The next morning, I took the call from my car, parked 3 blocks from my apartment. Habit. Paranoia earned honestly. Nina didn't waste time. I left because I was tired of being grateful, she said flatly. I said nothing. He never touched me, she continued, anticipating the wrong assumption. That would have been sloppy. It was always dinners, advice, warnings disguised as kindness. And then HR. What kind of warnings? I asked. She laughed once, bitter. That some people were indispensable, that others were replaceable, especially those of us without citizenship. She told me about a consulting bonus that arrived after she declined a second dinner, about being advised to look elsewhere before circumstances changed, about an off-the-record suggestion that her visa renewal might face delays if the company restructured. They hadn't needed to threaten her. They just needed to remind her how fragile everything was. After Nina, I spoke to Carla, an HR assistant who'd quit abruptly 3 years ago and now worked in healthcare administration. Then Lena, now at a competitor, who refused to speak on the phone but sent careful, measured emails full of dates and words she'd clearly rehearsed for years. Different voices, same structure, opportunities framed as favors, resistance reframed as risk. Silence rewarded with clean exits and money that felt like both apology and payment. None of the women used Richard's name first. They didn't have to. I never recorded conversations. That was important. Recordings could be challenged, dismissed, buried in procedural arguments. What mattered were alignments, timelines, overlaps, consistencies that formed something sturdier than individual testimony. I built charts again, but these were human ones. Nina's dinner happened 3 days after a certain consulting invoice. Carla's warning arrived 2 weeks before her manager's calendar suddenly filled with external partner meetings. Lena's exit coincided exactly with the onboarding of one of the shell firms I'd already flagged. Stories don't match by coincidence. By Friday morning, I had spoken to 6 women, 6 survivors. I was no longer alone, but I had to be careful not to let relief soften my edges. Being believed was intoxicating. It could make you careless. Richard checked in again at noon. Richard Coleman. Still good for tonight? I've got a bottle I think you'll appreciate. I stared at the message while listening to Nina's voice replay in my memory. I typed a response slowly. Running behind on something critical. Need to finish it first. I'll follow up. He replied almost immediately. Of course. I admire your dedication. Predators always praised focus in their prey. That night I didn't sleep. I encrypted everything I had. Timelines, transaction maps, annotated policies, and split the archive into pieces. No single file made sense alone. No single failure would erase the whole. Cloud storage in 3 countries. Physical backup hidden where it wouldn't be found by accident. Another copy prepared to be time-released if I didn't intervene. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. Before dawn, I added one last entry to my notebook. Allies identified. Independent testimonies align without coordination. Systemic pattern confirmed beyond financial records. Next step, distribution. No single point of failure. I closed the notebook and sat back, watching morning light creep across the walls. Richard thought dinners were negotiations. He didn't understand what had really been happening. While he had been collecting silence, I had been collecting witnesses. And silence, once shared, lost its power. Richard didn't like waiting. I learned that the moment his tone changed, not in words, but in rhythm. Messages that once arrived hours apart now came minutes after I left him unread. Politeness hardened into expectation. Expectation leaned toward entitlement. By Friday afternoon, the office felt charged, like a room before a storm where everyone pretended not to hear thunder in the distance. I kept my expression neutral, my behavior identical to every other day. Consistency was camouflage. At 4:18, his name appeared on my phone again. Richard Coleman, checking in. Should I send a car? I watched the typing indicator blink, vanish, blink again, as if urgency itself were tapping the glass. I let 3 minutes pass before replying. Still finalizing something critical tied to risk review. Might run late. I chose the words carefully. Not no, never no, just delay. Delay weakened leverage without provoking retaliation. His response came slower this time. Understood. Just don't work too hard. A warning dressed as concern. I stood, gathered my things, and walked out of the building deliberately early. Appearances mattered. I wanted my absence noted without explanation. If Richard asked around, he would hear nothing unusual. Emma left at a normal time. Emma was reliable. At home, I didn't sit down. I moved. I checked every backup again. Verified encryption keys. Confirmed scheduled releases. One package was set to go to the board's general counsel. Another to an external audit firm with an impeccable reputation and a documented intolerance for reputational exposure. A third sat, dormant but ready, addressed to federal investigators. The fourth, a partial, human-focused bundle, was prepared for an immigration advocacy organization that specialized in employer misconduct. No one would see everything at once. Everyone would see enough. At 6:30, my phone rang. Richard. I answered on the fourth ring, letting just a hint of breathlessness into my voice. "Richard, you okay?" he asked. "You sound distracted." "I am," I said lightly. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about." A pause. He hadn't expected that. "Oh," he prompted. "I may need to push dinner," I continued. "I uncovered something irregular. It's probably nothing, but it's pulling me back into data I didn't expect." His silence stretched longer this time. When he spoke, his voice had cooled. "What kind of data?" I smiled to myself. "Compliance-related. Legacy processes. You know how those things linger." I could almost see him recalibrating, running through internal maps, searching for exposure without yet knowing where to look. Fear didn't show itself as panic in men like Richard. It showed up as sudden restraint. "Well," he said carefully now, "those things can wait. There's no need to overextend yourself." That was new. "Maybe," I replied, "but I'd rather be thorough." Another pause. Shorter, controlled. "We'll reschedule," he said. Not a suggestion. A decision. "Focus on what you need to." "Thank you," I said, and meant something entirely different. We hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't celebrate. I didn't relax. The most dangerous moment was when power sensed its grip weakening, but hadn't yet accepted loss. That was when people like Richard escalated quietly. I opened my laptop one last time. Each file set went out on a staggered timer. Not immediately, not all at once. I wanted confusion, overlapping reactions, questions forming simultaneously in different rooms, too fast for coordination. At 7:42 p.m., the first package left my control. At 7:47, the second. I watched the confirmation logs appear, one by one, each notification a door closing behind me. At 8, my phone buzzed again. "Richard Coleman. We should talk Monday, in person." I didn't reply. At 8:15, I powered everything down, slid the laptop into my bag, and sat on the floor of my living room with my back against the couch. Only then did I allow my hands to shake. This was it. The point of no return. Fear came. Not sharp, not overwhelming, but present enough to deserve respect. I acknowledged it, breathed through it, and let it pass. Fear meant something mattered. Around 9, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. Receipt confirmed. Review initiated. No signature, just professionalism. I closed my eyes. Richard believed the second dinner would determine the outcome. That proximity equaled control. That as long as he dictated the setting, he dictated the terms. He never understood that the most important work had already been done far from any table in quiet rooms by women who had learned to survive by observing instead of confronting. The dinners were over. He just didn't know it yet. On Monday, the consequences would begin arriving. Polite at first, procedural, wrapped in language that sounded like curiosity. And once questions started, they would not stop. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the city outside continue as if nothing had changed. The audit still didn't exist, but its echo had already begun. Nothing happened the next morning. No alarms, no urgent emails, no security at my desk. For a brief, disorienting moment, I wondered if I had miscalculated, if the system was stronger than I thought, if it had absorbed the shock without cracking. That illusion lasted until 10:12 a.m. The first sign was subtle. A calendar notification I hadn't scheduled, labeled simply compliance review, mandatory attendance, no organizer listed, no agenda attached, just a conference room on the executive floor and a time 30 minutes away. I didn't rush. Panic made people sloppy. I gathered my notebook, took a sip of water, and walked to the elevator with the same measured stride I used every day. The difference was internal. I was no longer reacting. I was observing. The conference room held 4 people when I arrived: General Counsel, Head of Internal Audit, an unfamiliar man in a conservative suit I recognized instantly as external, and an empty chair. No Richard. "Emma," the General Counsel said pleasantly, "thank you for coming on short notice." "Of course," I replied. "I assume this is about risk exposure." The external auditor's eyebrow flicked upward before he masked it. "Yes," the internal audit head said slowly, "among other things." They asked careful questions, open-ended: how I defined scope, why I accessed certain data sets, whether I'd observed anomalies before initiating my review. The tone wasn't accusatory, it was alert, awake. The kind of alertness that arrived only when senior leadership realized something serious might already be moving without them. I answered everything truthfully and narrowly: policy citations, dates, definitions, procedural justifications. I referred repeatedly to the compliance clause by name and version number. They followed along, silently checking my references. At no point did I accuse anyone. At no point did I need to. When the meeting ended, the external auditor remained seated. "We'll need continued access to your reconstructed data views," he said, "and your timelines." "You have them," I said. "Or rather, parts of them." He smiled faintly. "Yes, we're beginning to see how those fit together." By noon, the building's atmosphere had shifted. Conversations fell quiet when unfamiliar faces passed. Directors closed office doors. Meetings were canceled without explanation. At 1:15, Richard's assistant walked briskly past my desk without making eye contact. At 2:40, an email went company-wide announcing an unscheduled systems audit affecting certain departments. Routine language, anything but routine intent. I stayed at my desk, visible and calm. Then, just after 3, the elevators opened and spilled something new into the open floor. Stillness. People looked up, whispered. Phones emerged. Richard Coleman was being escorted down the hallway by 2 men I'd never seen before. Not uniformed. No spectacle. Just firm hands on invisible boundaries. His face was pale, composed, carefully neutral. As he passed, his eyes met mine. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. He didn't look angry. He looked confused. I held his gaze, not with triumph, not with contempt, but with recognition. This was the moment he understood that leverage had limits, that silence was not ownership. Then he was gone. The rest happened fast. Resignations framed as personal decisions, administrative leave, emails recalling previous emails, systems locked, then unlocked under new oversight. Names surfaced quietly in places they had never been spoken before. By the end of the week, 3 executives were out. 2 consulting contracts terminated retroactively. HR leadership restructured. No press release mentioned misconduct. No announcement referenced abuse. But the dinners, those finally emerged. Not as rumors, not as whispers, but as documented patterns appended to compliance memos and legal briefs. Sanitized enough for corporate digestion. Clear enough to stand. I received one final message from an unknown number. "It's over. Thank you." I didn't ask who sent it. On Friday evening, as the building emptied earlier than usual, I packed my bag knowing I wouldn't be back for much longer. My role here, this phase of it, was complete. The audit still had no name, but it had done its work. The first headline broke on a Sunday morning. I wasn't looking for it. I'd learned not to search my own name, not to track stories that might metastasize if touched too often. Still, News has a way of finding you when it decides you're relevant. Senior finance executive detained in ongoing federal investigation. No photo, no details. Just jurisdiction names and neutral language designed to avoid prejudice while confirming gravity. By the second paragraph, the article referenced long-term financial irregularities tied to external consulting entities. By the third, it cited potential abuse of authority involving immigration-dependent employees. Richard Coleman's name appeared once, near the bottom. I closed the browser and sat very still. 3 weeks earlier, he'd been worrying about wine pairings. The arrest itself came quietly, the way everything truly serious does. Not in the office, not before an audience. Federal agents visited his home early, just as routine demanded. No shouting, no dramatic resistance. Just procedure, paperwork, and consequences arriving exactly when scheduled. I learned this later, secondhand, from someone who knew someone. The kind of knowledge that traveled softly because everyone understood it didn't belong to them. On Monday, the company email arrived. Richard Coleman is no longer employed with Colemanson Group. We are cooperating fully with authorities. We remain committed to integrity and transparency. It said nothing about handcuffs. Inside the office, his name became toxic immediately. People avoided it the way children avoided mirrors when afraid of monsters. Conversations reoriented themselves mid-sentence. Praise redirected. Criticism reframed. The machine adjusted. What followed was fallout. Not explosive, but relentless. More names surfaced as investigators worked backward through approval chains. A senior manager resigned to spend time with family. Another accepted a plea deal no one discussed openly. Consulting firms dissolved overnight, their websites vanishing as if they'd never existed. The money trails widened. So did the human ones. I began receiving messages, not from reporters, not from executives, but from women. Some I recognized, some I didn't. I see now it wasn't just me. Thank you for putting words where I couldn't. I thought I was crazy. I wasn't. I didn't reply to most of them, not because I didn't care, but because they didn't need reassurance from me. The truth had already done its work. Silence, this time, protected them. One message did stop me. It came from Nina. He took a deal, gave them everything. Names, structures, records. He tried to argue it was mutual. They didn't agree. I exhaled slowly. Of course he did. When men like Richard lost control, they reached for narratives that preserved dignity at any cost. Mutual was the word people used when power had always been one-directional. At work, my presence became complicated. No one accused me of anything, but glances lingered longer. Praise came more loudly than before. Invitations multiplied. People wanted proximity, not out of kindness, but safety. Aligning with me felt strategic now. That told me everything I needed to know. I scheduled a meeting with HR, not the ones who remained from before, but the interim director tasked with cultural reconstruction. I won't be staying, I said calmly once we'd exchanged pleasantries. She blinked. We were hoping to discuss expanded responsibilities. I'm sure, I replied, but my work here is done. That wasn't entirely true. Systems like this never truly finished breaking, but my role, the invisible analyst, the quiet disruptor, had reached its natural end. When I left the building for the last time, security nodded more respectfully than usual. The glass doors parted without hesitation. Outside, the city moved on, unconcerned with individual reckonings. That evening, I watched the sun set from my apartment window and allowed myself a single indulgence: relief. Richard was not special. The system had produced him, rewarded him, and protected him until it couldn't. His arrest mattered not because it was satisfying, but because it proved something many didn't believe. That power could be outpaced by patience. That silence, once shared, collapsed. That the audit never needed a name to be real. The consequences were more than enough. The room was smaller than I expected. No panoramic windows, no polished wood table meant to impress. Just beige walls, a flag in the corner, and a desk worn smooth by elbows and paperwork. The immigration officer across from me looked tired in the way of someone who had seen too many stories reduce themselves to forms. "Ms. Walker," she said, adjusting the file in front of her. "Thank you for waiting." I nodded. Waiting I could do. I had built a career out of it. This was the last gate. Not the most dramatic, not the most dangerous, but the one everything else had led toward. Power wore many costumes. Here, it wore bureaucracy. She reviewed the documents without speaking for a long moment. Employment history, letters from external firms, certifications, a formal commendation from an audit body that never mentioned why it existed. Everything clean, everything factual. No drama. "You've had a complicated employment situation," she said at last. "That's one word for it," I replied evenly. She glanced up, measuring tone more than content. Then she smiled faintly, almost apologetically. "I won't pretend this is routine, but it is clear." She slid one document forward. "Your status has been extended. Permanently." The word landed softly and changed the gravity of the room. Permanent. No renewal cycles, no leverage disguised as administrative delay, no future dinners carrying invisible conditions. "Thank you," I said, and meant it without irony. She hesitated, then added, "You should know. Your cooperation has already influenced several ongoing policy reviews. You weren't required to do any of that." "I know," I replied. She studied me for a second longer, then closed the file. "You're free to go." Outside, the air felt lighter. Not euphoric, just unclenched. I stood on the steps of the building and let the city noise wash over me, grounding and anonymous. For the first time in years, my future felt unnegotiated. I didn't return to the company. I sent a short, polite resignation email the next morning. No explanations, no gratitude beyond professional courtesy. They replied within minutes, overflowing with understanding and offers to reconsider. I declined all of them. Instead, I registered a small consulting firm. The work came quickly, quietly. Organizations rarely called because they wanted to be ethical. They called because something felt wrong and they couldn't name it. Numbers that behaved too well. Turnover patterns HR couldn't explain. Executives who inspired fear instead of trust. I specialized in risks no one wanted to see. Unofficial audits, pattern analysis, structural exposure mapping. The kind of work that didn't accuse, it revealed. Sometimes the findings led to reform, sometimes to consequences, sometimes to both. I didn't ask what happened afterward unless it mattered. Distance preserved clarity. Occasionally, I received updates anyway. Richard Coleman pled guilty to multiple charges: abuse of authority, financial misconduct, obstruction. His sentence was reduced in exchange for cooperation, though the reduction did nothing to restore what he'd taken from others. Helix Advisory Group dissolved. So did the rest. Policies were rewritten. Clauses I'd once had to dig for were pulled forward, bolded, required reading now. Committees were formed. Oversight expanded. Machines repaired themselves slowly. On a quiet evening months later, I reread my old notebook before shredding it page by page. Dates, timelines, observations. Proof of a version of me that no longer needed to exist. The audit, officially, had never happened. No project code remained active. No report bore my name. There was nothing to point to and say this is where it began. But absence is also evidence. The dinners stopped. The silence broke. The pattern collapsed. And I stayed. That was the difference. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped surviving and started choosing. Not loudly, not publicly, just decisively. Power had mistaken my quiet for compliance. It wasn't. It was preparation. And now, finally, it was over.